Hi everybody, it's me, Jack Wallen. I'm here again with another Linux 101, and it has been a while. And I'm sorry, but unfortunately life got in the way. I got really sick, and then I went on vacation. And then when I got back from vacation, things just kind of, spiraled away from me. But here I am, again, with you and for you. And today, it's opinion time. Opinion time, opinion time, opinion, I don't, whatever. So, the opinion I'm about to share is probably not going to be very popular with a lot of people, because you'll understand in a minute. And I'm sure that a lot of you are going to have something to say about it. And it might not always be something good to say. That's fine. It's a free world. And your opinion is valid. I respect your opinion. It may or may not, well, I was going to say it may or may not be right, but opinions really, whatever. Okay, let's get to it, right? Okay. So, this week I'm going to write about Rhino Linux. Not necessarily a review of Rhino Linux, because I've written a couple of reviews of Rhino Linux. I really, really like Rhino Linux because it's really, I've said really too much. Rhino Linux is cool. It's just flat out cool. It looks cool. It performs, can it perform cool? It's just cool. Now, if you've ever used Rhino Linux, or if you've just spun up a virtual machine of Rhino Linux and you've experienced it, you know that it has used the XFCE desktop. And what the developers have done is kind of tweaked and twisted the XFCE desktop to turn it into something really unique and really, say it with me now, cool. But everything's always got to have a big but. The developers are creating their own desktop environment. Now, you're probably thinking, we don't need another desktop environment. Linux has enough of them. Enough. You're spreading it too thin. There are too many choices and they confuse everybody. But here's what I have to say to that, and this is probably where my opinion might veer away from yours, like all the way to Mars, maybe. I think it's good. I think it's great. And here's why I think that. And you have to understand, my opinion is coming out of decades of using Linux. And essentially what it boils down to is that it gets really old after a while. Now, of course, you have to remember, this is coming from someone who reviews Linux distributions for a living. That's not all I do for a living, but part of what I do for a living is review Linux distributions. And it gets really old going, okay, it's another distribution that uses GNOME. It's another distribution that uses KDE Plasma. Another distribution that uses Pantheon or LXCE or you name it, Budgie. So one of the things I tend to do is when I go to download a distribution to review, I'll look to see if they have variations. And if they have variations, I'll look for one that, that appeals to me in that moment. And for example, if the distribution defaults to GNOME, I'm probably going to look to see if they have a different option, like one with KDE Plasma or XFCE or something else, because we all know what GNOME does. We all know what it looks like. We all know what it's capable of. Same thing with KDE Plasma. Same thing with XFCE. We all know them. And sometimes when I set out to review a new Linux distribution, a new release, or even a new Linux distribution, I'll spin up a virtual machine of it, and I'll immediately think, okay, what does this distribution do that's different than other distributions? And one of the first things I look at is, how does it lay out the desktop? Do the developers take their time to come up with a different take on KDE Plasma or GNOME or XFCE or LXQT or Pantheon or Budgie or blah, blah, bitty blah. What do? How do they make it different? Because it gets really old. Spinning up a virtual machine of yet another Linux distribution that looks just like the one I reviewed last week. It gets tired. It's tiresome. So when I can find something like Rhino Linux that might take XFCE and turn it into something wholly different, I'm like, this is cool. I like this. I like what they're doing. And I truly do. I think the developers of Rhino Linux are doing a bang-up job with the desktop. And so when I found out that they were actually planning on developing their own desktop for Rhino Linux, I was like, huzzah, freaking za. And so yesterday I downloaded the latest ISO of Rhino Linux, spun up a virtual machine, installed Rhino Linux. Of course, it was still using the XFCE desktop, but there are instructions on the Rhino Linux page that inform you how to install their new desktop. Of course, it's still early on, so there's going to be bugs. There's going to be problems. There's going to be, it's probably not going to work exactly as you expect it. And in fact, when I installed their new desktop, I can't even remember what it's called, but I installed it, and the first thing I noticed was it still said XFCE in the top right, top left corner, right? So, and then there are a few little quirks that I'm pretty sure they're probably going to iron out. For example, to get to the desktop menu, you have to use I can't remember if it's a right or left click on your mouse on the desktop, which I do appreciate, because remember, two of the first desktop environments that really struck me back in the late 90s were AfterStep and Enlightenment, and both of those have desktop menus. So you click anywhere, you left click, right click, yes, right click anywhere on the desktop, and it opens up a menu where you can access all of your applications and all that. And I've always found that really efficient and convenient, because you don't have to first drag your cursor all the way down to the bottom left or up to the top left, or hit your super key to open up the menu. You can just click anywhere you want. Blammo, there's menu. And looks like that might be the way that Rhino Linux is going, which I think is fantastic. And it's the thing about the new Rhino Linux desktop is it's laid out the same way as their version of XFCE. So there's a dock on the left side of the display. There's a top bar at the top, of course. It's got the same kind of theme. Now, strangely enough, after I installed the Rhino Linux desktop, I went to the wallpaper was blank. It was a black screen. I thought, okay, well, that's a little glitch in the matrix. So I did the old. This is universal symbol for right click on the mouse. Is that the finger you use to right click, or do you use this one? I use actually a mouse that doesn't move. It's a trackball that stands like this. So I think I use this finger. It doesn't matter. What the heck? I don't know what I'm talking about. So where was I? Okay, so I did the right click of the mouse, and it said, desktop settings or whatever. And then I went to wallpaper, and it was all XFCE wallpapers. And the default Rhino Linux wallpaper, which is really cool, wasn't there. It's like, what's going on here? Rhino Linux? You're creating your own desktop, but you're depending on the XFCE wallpapers? Come on. So I actually had to search for the Rhino Linux desktop wallpapers and found the one I liked, downloaded it, and applied it. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, now it's looking really cool. This is really cool. And you can see where they're going with it. You see where they're going with the desktop, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating, and I think it's smart of them to stick with the layout they had with XFCE while still making it unique. It's the same thing that System 76 is doing with Cosmic Desktop. If you've tried Cosmic Desktop, if you've used Pop! OS and you've tried Cosmic Desktop, you look at them and they're like, well, they're kind of the same. But then you see the subtle differences and the fact that it performs a heck of a lot better than the current Pop! OS desktop. But that's really smart because their user base has grown accustomed to the way how to interact with the desktop. And to change that would have been a mistake. And that makes me think of when, do you remember when Canonical made the mistake of migrating the Ubuntu desktop to, what was it called? Oh my gosh. I can't even think of what it was called. Unity, the Unity desktop. Now, I thought Unity was awesome. I thought Unity was one of the most efficient desktops on the market. It was cool looking and it functioned really well, but most people didn't like it. The reason most people didn't like it is because it was different. People don't like change, especially within the Linux community, because a lot of times people will choose a distribution based on how the desktop looks and how the desktop performs. So when all of a sudden you're accustomed to the Rhino Linux desktop, which is fantastic in its XFCE kind of way, and if the developer said, okay, we're going to develop our own desktop, but it's going to be way different. It's going to be so different, but it's going to be so awesome. They're going to lose users because the users will be like, what do I do here? I don't know what to do. So they stuck with what they knew. They stuck with what the users knew. They stuck with what works, but they're going about it in a different way. Now, why do I think that is good for the Linux community? I think it's good because of what I've been saying all along. You know, it's after a while, it's just it gets tired. It's tiresome to test a yet another Linux distribution that's based on that uses the same old. And I know that there is a lot of people in the Linux community think that Linux is too fragmented, that there's too many choices, and all of those choices confuse users. But I think the goal, or what we should be doing, is there should be a limited number of Linux distributions that we as a community, especially those of us who have platforms, point those new users to. And we do that all the time. I can't tell you how many times I've written articles that say, there's the best 5 Linux distributions for new users. And typically they're the same distributions every year. It's Ubuntu, it's Linux Mint, it's Elementary OS, it's Zorin OS, and maybe Ubuntu Budgie. Or yeah, Ubuntu Budgie. Maybe those 5. You know, year by year you can probably mix and match one. Take out Ubuntu Budgie and plop in Kubuntu, which is the Ubuntu version with KDE Plasma. And so we have those handful of distributions for new users. And then we remind those new users, say, okay, start with this, start here. Now, this kind of reminds me of something that I was going to talk about a while ago and I decided not to. There's kind of like this Linux ladder of distributions that starts out with the really easy ones. It starts out with those 5 that I kind of I mentioned, and then when a new Linux user starts using those, and eventually they get accustomed to how Linux works, and if they get bored, they might go, okay, I like this, let me try something else. And then they climb up the next rung in the ladder, where it might be Fedora, it might be OpenSUSE, you know, so it's a little more advanced. And then you climb up the ladder the next time, and then you're at maybe Arch Linux, and you climb up another rung, and you're at Gentoo, and then you climb up the final ladder, and you're at Linux from scratch. So it's what I think is great about this is that you have these desktop environments that really should be aimed at new users because they tend to stay the same. right? The Ubuntu that you use now is very similar to the Ubuntu that was available 5 years ago. And so that familiarity is a comfort to new users, right? But imagine though that, okay, so one of my problems, well, I have a lot of problems with Windows. I have a lot of problems with Windows because it's just a crappy OS. It is. I don't want to go off on that. Let's just not go off on that. But one of my problems is that for example, you start using Windows 11 and it's similar to Windows 10. And so you've probably been using Windows 10 and Windows 11 for what? 5 or 10 years total? And for me, that would drive me crazy. Because I sit at my desk for quite a while each day, and I'm looking at this desktop environment, and I get bored with them. I get bored with desktop environments, and I want to change. And if these developers, like the Rhino Linux developers, if they didn't take a chance on creating something new, people like me who get bored of their desktops would eventually just kind of cycle through the same old desktops over and over and over and over and over again. And when you start, let's say you start with GNOME and you cycle through all the different desktops and you get back to GNOME, you're like, well, it's the same old GNOME. Whoop-de-doo. And the more desktop environments we get, the more we have to choose from. And the less likely we are to get bored. On top of which, the more likely it is we're going to find something new and exciting. And that's from maybe not from day one, but from the early days, one of the beautiful things about Linux and open source is choice. If you don't like it, change it. Right? And the other thing about what Rhino Linux is doing, and I've seen this happen with a lot of distributions, is that Rhino Linux desktop as you see it now is based on XFCE. What that means is that the Rhino Linux developers are dependent on XFCE, and they're dependent on the XFCE developers to do their thing, right? But that could also be limiting to the Rhino Linux users. So when the Rhino Linux developers say, okay, we're going to go off in our own direction, we're going to create our own desktop. Maybe it's based on XFCE. I don't know, but it's going to be unique. It's going to be ours, but it's going to look the same as it was. But what that gives those developers is a freedom to take that desktop off in any direction they want. And they are not dependent on XFCE. I mean, think about this. Think about it this way. Let's just say, for example, that Rhino Linux sticks with the XFCE desktop. And let's just say the XFCE, I'm not saying that this happens because the XFCE developers are really good. But let's just say, for example, that the XFCE developers kind of slow down. Or their next release keeps getting pushed back. And the Rhino Linux developers are wanting to release their latest iteration now. Or soon, sooner than the XFCE developers are going to release their next iteration of their desktop. If that's the case, when that's the case, because it does happen, the Rhino Linux developers feel stuck. And they can't do what they want to do. So now that they have taken things into their own hands, the Rhino Linux developers can do what they want to do, when they want to do it, and how they want to do it. Which could be an absolute boon to Rhino Linux users, because all of a sudden the Rhino Linux developers could say, hey, this is a really cool idea, let's add it. Or their users could say, hey, Rhino Linux developers, you're awesome, thank you, I would like to see this feature on the desktop. The Rhino Linux developers could look at that email or whatever and say, oh, we hadn't thought of that before. And the XFCE developers haven't thought about that before. Let's make that happen. So they do, and voila. the Rhino Linux desktop environment has evolved, and evolved much faster than it might have otherwise. And it evolved in a way that excites the user base. We all need a little bit of excitement now and then, don't we? Kitty cats. Rower. So I know that a lot of people out there in the Linux community look down upon this sort of thing. In fact, there are people in the Linux community that would rather there maybe be 4 or 5 different desktop environments, so that there's less choice, so there's less confusion. But that's not what Linux and open source is about. Linux and open source is about freedom and choice. And the more choice, the better. Right? Am I right? Am I right or am I wrong? I mean, granted, this is opinion, so meh. And it's opinion from somebody you probably don't know. I mean, who am I, right? I guess never mind. I'm not going to go there. Anyway, my lovely people, thank you so very, 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 very much for being patient with me in my absence. I hope that I didn't upset anybody because I was gone for so long. And, you know, because in internet time, 2 weeks is like... I do suggest that you download an ISO of Rhino Linux, install it on a virtual machine or on a spare computer, and install their new desktop. Give it a try. I think you'll like it. It's still rough around the edges, but I think you'll like it. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again very much. It is a pleasure to chat with you or chat to you or whatever this is. If you like what you hear, spread the word. Thank you again, and I hope that you and everyone you know and love have a wonderful, wonderful day.